Hi everyone, my name's Leah. I'm an assistant coach at Outspoken, and today we're going to talk about deconstructing actors, specifically feminists. So what's in the agenda for today? Firstly, we're going to talk about what is an actor and why are they important. Then we're going to talk about how we can characterize actors in debates. Third, we're going to talk about the feminists, specifically as an actor in debates. And then finally, a little bit of practice for us. So let's get started, right? What is an actor? So in debate, actors are people that the motion could affect or revolve around. So often they're very obvious actors, right? These actors intuitively come to mind when you're thinking about the motion, and sometimes they might be even mentioned in the motion itself. So look at this iceberg, right? So the intuitive or obvious actors are very visible or easy to kind of suss out. And then you have the less obvious but also important actors, right? So they're at the bottom of the water level, right? So they're not that visible, but they're also still as important. So let's look at this motion. Assuming feasibility, this house would replace all human roles in the criminal justice system, for example, judges, juries, etc., with artificial intelligence. So with this motion, can you try thinking of two obvious actors? And how about two not so obvious actors? So you can pause the video here if you'd like to answer first. Okay, so for me, the obvious actors would be judges and juries, which are mentioned in the motion itself, and in criminals, because we're talking about the criminal justice system, right? And then for the not so obvious actors, I'm thinking AI developers, or the people who design the artificial intelligence that we're going to be using, right? And then the victims of the crimes that we're going to try or they're going to be tackling in these criminal justice systems. But why are all these things so important, right? Why is it so important that we know these obvious and not so obvious actors? So debate motions often revolve around how or why certain people behave or will act, how they make decisions, how they will benefit from certain things, etc. And to be able to make a compelling argument, the foundation of that argument must first be strong. Part of your foundation is the characterization of your actors, or how well you can flesh out the people that are involved in the debate. So I always tell our students that framing a debate is a lot like telling a story from scratch. Your audience doesn't know anything about the story, so you can't tell the story well, or they can't understand the story well if you don't characterize the characters well, right? If the characters are vague, if it's unsure. Otherwise, how else would you convince the audience that a certain actor or a character will do a certain act? So have you heard of the term character inconsistencies? So in screenplay or film, right, this refers to when a character acts in a way that is not consistent with how the audience believes they are likely to act. So in films or shows, this can be done deliberately as a strategic film tactic of sorts, right? But in debate, having character inconsistencies and not being able to back them up are really bad, right? So a character inconsistency might look like, let's say you have this particular actor that is very, they have a very strong moral compass, right? So they always act in accordance to the law, right? It wouldn't make a lot of sense if they suddenly just break the law or that they suddenly commit a crime, right? Because we already think that they're not going to, based on how their moral compass is so strong, right? So in debate, we do this thing called the likelihood analysis, right? Likelihood analysis basically means how or why or how likely or why is a thing likely to happen, right? So with actors, it's how likely an actor will behave a certain way. With character inconsistencies, this likelihood analysis becomes difficult to kind of like reconcile, right? Because it's not going to be likely that they're going to do a certain act since it's inconsistent with how you've already set them up to be. So being able to characterize your actors well is very, very important in order for us to prove to the judge and the listeners that a certain behavior is going to happen. And this also provides the foundation of your argumentation. If your argument or your claim is that, going back to our AI criminal justice motion, right? If your claim is that AI judges are less likely to make emotion-related mistakes, then you would have needed to explain how human judges are comparatively more likely to make those mistakes. So when you characterize those human judges, you might want to focus on explaining that humans have certain explicit or implicit bias that influences their judgments, right? So especially implicit bias. Implicit means you don't know about it. You're not aware of it, right? So even if you're the most honest judge, even if you care very much about delivering justice, but you don't know that you have an implicit bias of maybe sexism, right? You favor men over women, right? Then this judge, as honest as they are, can still run the risk of delivering a kind of biased judgment, right? And it's still going to skew the scales in favor of the ruling power, which is in that case of sexism, men, right? And this is especially because it's implicit. They don't know that they have these biases, right? So it's very important that you know your character, that you can flesh out what the character has in terms of their characteristics, their thoughts, how they might feel, right? Or what are they motivated by? We're going to talk more about this in the next section, right? In order for those arguments, in order for the likelihood to be proven, right? But before we go on, let's talk about a checkpoint. Let's check if you can still recall the matters I discussed earlier. So you can pause the video here to answer first before I go through the answers. So firstly, what is an actor? Secondly, in general, what are the two types of actors are there in debates? And then finally, why are characterizing actors important? So an actor, as we talked about earlier, are the people who are affected by a debate, or kind of like where the motion revolves around, or whom rather, right? In general, there are two types. There's the obvious actors, and then there's the not so obvious actors, right? And then finally, it's important to characterize these actors because they lay the foundation for your argumentation later on, or trying to prove that a certain action is going to likely happen, or a certain behavior is going to be done. All right, now that we've already talked about why it's so important to characterize actors, let's talk about how we can actually characterize actors. So we do this by answering the 5W1H. So I'm sure you guys have heard of this before. It's who, what, when, where, and why, right? And then how. So when characterizing actors, there are a few questions to ask ourselves and ideally answer in our speeches. So firstly, who is the actor? I think this is pretty straightforward. Secondly, what are their incentives, their motivations, or interests? So these refer to the things that a person might want or need, or will push them to act in a certain way. Third is their limitations. So this refers to the extent to which they can take certain actions. So for example, if I'm a parent as an actor, right? My motivations or my incentives would be probably to protect my child from harm. But I wouldn't be able to reasonably or feasibly completely isolate my child and restrict their movements to protect them from harm, right? So, I mean, technically you could, but it's not reasonable to do, right? So that's my limitation. I can't do that. So that's not something that is feasible for me as a goal, right? Next is, why are they important? Why are these actors important or relevant to the debate? So they might be vulnerable in society. We might have a duty to protect them, and etc. An example of this would be maybe children, right? In certain motions, we have to prove if they are the actor. We probably need to prove that they're important because we might need to protect them because they're not yet empowered or equipped with the skills to protect themselves. So perhaps as the state or as their parents, you need to protect them, and that's why they're relevant to the debate. And finally, how is the actor likely to act as a result? As a result of their incentives, motivations, and limitations, right? How are they going to act, right? So keeping all of these in mind can help you answer kind of what are the certain characteristics that your actor should have. So as I told you earlier, right, when you frame a debate or when you characterize certain actors in the debate, rather, always begin with believing that your participants, your debaters, your judge, they don't know anything about the story that you're going to tell. So you need to be able to kind of illustrate a picture that is as comprehensive as possible. So answering these questions might help you create that kind of well fleshed out image so that they're able to understand the kind of actor that you're fighting for, you're trying to discuss within the debate. So let's have another checkpoint, right? So again, you can pause this video to answer first before I go through the answer. So what are the 5W1H questions that we can ask ourselves when we're characterizing the actor in a debate? So you might recall, first is, who is the actor? Secondly, what are their incentives, motivations, interests? Third is, what are their limitations? Fourth, why are they important or relevant to the debate? And then finally, how are these actors likely to act as a result of those incentives, motivations, and limitations? Okay, So feminism is a common topic in any debate. Did you know that there's many different perspectives within feminism itself? So it's important to know these, right? Even if just briefly, so that you can decide strategically in a debate what kind of feminist actor you would want to defend or characterize. Okay, so here are a few. So in truth, there are so many more different schools of thought within feminism itself that I cannot possibly cover all of them today, but you might want to do more research on this if you're interested. So I'm just going to talk about some of them. Just a little bit of a, I guess, disclaimer before I go on. Obviously, each of these perspectives have their own flaws and criticisms. I'm not saying any of these versions or perspectives of feminism is the end all be all or definitely the most correct one, right? But it's important to see the different types of feminism out there, such that when you're characterizing a feminist actor in debates, you can see that there's a lot of different possible types of feminists that you can talk about. All right, so first is Marxist feminism, right? So when you talk about Marxist feminism, it talks about how people act because of material conditions. So material conditions, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to edit the slide, but basically material conditions are kind of like what affects the way that they live their life, right? Or like their livelihood, right? So this might include your wage, your job, etc. Women are oppressed by capitalism and not patriarchy. So in order to solve gender inequality, we must revolt against capitalism. So that's what Marxist feminism talks about. Next is liberal feminism. So according to liberal feminists, nobody benefits from existing inequalities because both men and women are harmed by this. Discrimination, however, prevents women from having those equal opportunities than men. And however, liberal feminists do not seek revolutionary changes. They want changes to take place within the existing structure. So they're not here to kind of like topple or overthrow the patriarchy. Patriarchy meaning a male-dominated structure or society, for example, right? For them, they just want to work within their means. Right? Next is radical feminism. So according to radical feminists, society is patriarchal. It's dominated and it's ruled by men. So men are the ruling class and women are the subject class. And therefore, to achieve gender equality is to oppose the patriarchy, right? So they blame the exploitation of women on men. It is primarily men who have benefited from the subordination of women, and therefore women are an oppressed group, according to radical feminists. Next, we have conservative feminism. So according to conservative feminists, an ideal woman is one who desires to be desired, ideally by men, and who embraces their femininity and or status as a woman, wife, and mother. So they believe in biological determinism, which basically means that our bodies are designed for us to be able to fulfill certain like gender roles in society. So for women, that's obviously to be nurturers, to be carers, to be mothers, for example. And they also believe that women are already equal to men in the West. And finally, we're going to talk about intersectional feminism. So intersectional feminists reject the idea that all women experience oppression and gender inequality in homogeneous ways. So that basically just means that women instead experience different degrees and manifestations of oppression based on different identities that they hold. So race, class, age, etc. So a white woman living in the West is less likely to be oppressed than a Black woman living in the West, even if both of them are women, right? The race is something that factors in, that also changes and it kind of like interacts with their experience of sexism, right? So now we know that there's a few types of different feminists. Again, that was not exhaustive. There's a very long list of feminist schools of thought. But let's talk about the feminist movement as an actor in a lot of debates. So in debate tournaments, there's usually at least one round that's gender with a theme, right? So I've noticed that in a lot of trainings, debaters often get intimidated by this theme of gender or feminism, right? I've heard typically male students preempt their speeches with, I'm not good with gender, so I'm really sorry for the bad speech. But let's not be intimidated, right? The truth is, the feminist as an actor is often still quite straightforward. And just like any actor, we can deconstruct their profile as well. All right. So as I told you earlier, in debates, a common actor in motions is the feminist movement. But what exactly is the feminist movement as an actor? So when you talk about the feminist movement, what comes to mind? It could be anything from incentives or interests like duties, responsibilities to limitations. So I want you to think about this. In relation to the motion, this house as the feminist movement would actively discourage women from joining the military. I want you to think about possible incentives, interests, maybe limitations, duties, responsibilities, etc. Anything that a feminist movement would have as a characteristic in relation to this motion, as I mentioned earlier. So you can pause the video here to ponder on this for a moment. Okay, so here's a possible answer to the question that I raised you earlier, right? So I'm assuming that you've already thought about your own answers, right? So you can check it or kind of compare it against mine. So I guess firstly, the incentive, right? So the feminist movement has a duty to protect and uphold women's and minorities' rights. So that's their incentive. That's what kind of motivates them to act, is that they have this duty to fulfill, right? The interest would be that the feminist movement would want to ensure that women have the freedom to choose for themselves, to have autonomy, to move freely, to pursue work that they want, to be respected and dignified, etc., right? To be safe or protected from violence, right? So the list goes on, right? And this is something that they want. This is their interest, right? And then finally, their limitations. So limitations would be that the feminist movement cannot get rid of patriarchal systems because as systems, they are too big to change, right? So what do I mean with this? Let's talk about it in relation to the motion earlier. So the feminist movement in relation to the motion cannot aim to undo patriarchal natures of militaries, right? Because being a patriarchal structure has been the structure of these male-dominated militaries for a very long time, right? So think of it kind of like as like a tree, a very old tree. Roots are well embedded into the ground, right? It spans pretty far and pretty deep, right? So being a patriarchal structure, the military, being a patriarchal structure, has roots that goes deep, deep, deep below the surface, right? So the feminist movement, even no matter what they do or no matter what they want to do, right? They can't feasibly and possibly just uproot those roots. They can't rid of those roots, right? Because it's so deeply embedded. In the same way, it's these ideas or these practices of patriarchy, the structure of patriarchy within the military is so deeply embedded that we can't reasonably expect the feminist movement to be able to solve that, right? So that's an example of a limitation that they might have. So before we go on to the practice, right, let's do a little bit of a checkpoint. So let's check if you still recall the matters that I discussed in this section. What are the 5 different perspectives of feminism? And briefly, what do they argue or stand for? Well, 5 different perspectives that I discussed. So you can pause the video here if you want to think about the answers first. All right, so first, we talked about Marxist feminism, right, where women are oppressed by capitalism and not the patriarchy. So in order to achieve gender equality, we should revolt against capitalism. Liberal feminism, on the other hand, talks about how discrimination prevents women from having equal opportunities as men, but solving the problem means working within the constraints of the system and not necessarily going against the system. In this case, patriarchy as a system, right? Next is radical feminism, which to them, solving gender inequality means having to dismantle the patriarchy because men oppress women through patriarchal structures. Next, we had conservative feminism, where men and women are believed to have biologically determined roles in society. So women's goal is to become desirable to men and perform those roles successfully. And they're typically traditional ones like motherhood or nurturing, right? And then lastly, we talked about intersectional feminism that believes that women experience different degrees of discrimination as a result of the intersection of their different identities or characteristics, such as race, class, age, etc. All right, I hope you're still with me. So finally, let's talk about this practice that we're going to do. We're going to try and write a piece of argumentation based on the actor analysis that we did earlier on the discouraging women from joining the military, right? So we're going to try and use the Peel format You can use any other argument structure if you're more comfortable with that. But in this example, for the purpose of this lesson, we're going to be using PEAL. So if you're unfamiliar with PEAL, it stands for Point, Explanation, Evidence, and Link. When you talk about your point, is to identify the main point and summarize the main idea of your argument. Secondly, you're going to explain, right? So you provide facts and evidence to back up your main idea. Then you provide evidence, which is to use the facts to support the main point or the claim that you're making. And then finally, link back to the main idea to reinforce the point that you're making. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. Using the PEAL format, construct a possible argument for the following motion with the incentive analysis that is provided below. So this is the one that we discussed in the previous section. So this houses the feminist movement would actively discourage women from joining the military. That's the motion. As we talked about earlier, the incentive was that the feminist movement has a duty to protect and uphold women's and or minorities' rights. The interest is that the feminist movement will want to ensure that women have the freedom to choose for themselves, to have autonomy, to live dignified lives, to be respected, right? To be able to pursue work that they want. And then finally, for limitations, is that the feminist movement cannot get rid or solve the patriarchal system, right? So you can pause the video here if you want to give yourself some time to think before I give you my answer as to how I would construct an argument in PEAL format with regards to this actor analysis that we talked about. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you've come up with an argument on your own by now. I'll show you my argument, which is quite a basic one, right? Based on the PEAL structure and the actor profile that we made earlier, right? So you can compare how your argument is structured with mine. All right, so assuming we're government, my point would be we should actively discourage women from joining the military because women are more likely to suffer than prosper in the military. So in a proper speech, I just shortened this to women are more likely to suffer than prosper in the military. So my explanation is that military systems are often patriarchal, where misogyny or hatred against women is often quite common because men are used to and taught to see women as inferior or less powerful because of the way that these systems are structured. So women are thus unable to be recognized for their best efforts and capability in such a system. They are also not guaranteed to be safe from violence or misogyny or any kind of gender-based discrimination. So they're unable to live the dignified lives that they deserve, right? So the evidence I have, right, is that we know this is true because we've seen it plenty of times. At worst, it may manifest as violence against women, as we've seen in cases of abuse against women within the military. And even at best, we see this through discrimination, such as refusing to give women career advancement opportunities or officials talking down to women in military. So here, I'm telling you how the problem plays out in reality. To help you identify this, in a lot of speeches, debaters might use the term, oh, this looks like XYZ in their speeches, right? So finally, the link. So this goes against what the feminist movement would want. Even though the feminist movement would want to let women decide for themselves what job to take, their duty to protect women and to guide women to make the best informed choice is more important because women's free choice is not really free if they are making them while not being fully informed of the consequences of these choices. As the feminist movement, they should actively discourage the women in order to highlight the potential dangers that women are subjected to within the military. The feminist movement cannot change the patriarchal nature of the military. This is their limitation. Therefore, actively discouraging women from joining is the next best thing that they can do to protect women from gender-based violence and discrimination within these patriarchal military systems, right? And therefore being more likely to protect women and their interests and ensure that they live dignified lives, right? So notice how I made sure to link it back to the actor profile we made earlier. This is incredibly crucial. The link part of your argument can determine if a judge is going to believe your case or not. So as you can see here, I talked about the interests of the feminist movement and the incentives as well in relation to the limitations that they have in place. I talked about a particular trade-off as well, right? Did you catch what the trade-off was? You can rewind the video if you want to, or you can try answering what the trade-off was first. Okay, so anyway, the trade-off that I made is that women might not be able to make the freest choice, right? Since actively discouraging them would influence their decisions, right? So if they want to join the military, the feminist movement actively discouraging them would kind of be like, hey, you're kind of infringing on their free choice, right? But I explained that for the feminist movement, protecting women, ensuring their safety, ensuring that they're not subjected to violence or being or having to lead undignified lives is more important, right? This is an important tie back to the feminist movement as an actor. Good arguments and characterizations, by the way, should be able to concede that there are certain limitations and trade-offs in any kind of situation. So be sure to look out for that when you're characterizing an actor and making an argument in the future. So that brings me to the end of this lesson. I hope you learned something new today, and thanks for listening. Bye.